Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian. Our gospel reading on this Reformation Sunday is from Luke 19. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through, and behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all grumbled. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So last Saturday, Danielle and I were at the Clemson game in South Carolina, right? It would have been far easier, would have been far cheaper too, for us to stay home and watch it on television. But it's different in person, right? It's a richer experience, right? To see it with your own eyes, to hear the roar of the crowd, to see the game unfold right before you. It's a different experience, right? And we had a blast. I think I had the guy next to me convinced I was a Clemson fan, until he started asking my opinions on wide receiver depth, at which point I smiled and nodded. But, you know, it was an entirely different experience. You know, there's 84,000 fans, like, screaming, and, you know, the stadium is just roaring and rocking, and it's right in front of you, and it's just a different experience. And lots of people feel this way, right? This is why it took us 3 hours to get from our hotel to the stadium when it should have taken about an hour and a half, right? Because lots of people want to see it in person. They want to experience it, because the experience can be transformative, right? And certainly, right, we all appreciated this during the pandemic, when all of a sudden all these things that we used to experience in person, we were then limited to experiencing over technology, to using Zoom, right? And so it was different, and certainly I would say it was better, you know, when we could go back to doing things in person again, right? It makes you think about, what have you waited in line for? Who have you waited in line for to see? I remember I once stood in the pouring rain to watch the Olympic torch go by, right? Because I wanted to see it. We wanted to experience it in person, because it's different, right? It's why people line up to see the presidential motorcades go by. It's why people wait in line for hours or drive for hours to catch a glimpse of someone famous, right? Because it's different to experience it in person for yourself. So who is that person? Who is that group for you? Right? For Zacchaeus, it was Jesus of Nazareth. He wanted to see him in person. It wasn't enough to hear about him passing through town. It wasn't enough to have someone else describe him. He wanted to see him for himself, to see him with his own eyes, to form his own opinion. But there's a little problem with that, right? Zacchaeus was despised. Right? In the Gospels, every once in a while, you hear the phrase tax collectors and sinners, right? And it tells you something about tax collectors, that they get their own category, right? It's not enough to lump them in with the rest of the sinners, right? They have their own special category of sin, right? And it makes me think about how we would think about that in today's society. Probably don't want to go into that this close to an election. It's dangerous ground, but I'm curious, right, about who we would lump, so blank and sinners, right? You know, and what does that say about society? What does that say about us? So tax collectors in Jerusalem, famously corrupt and despised, because they were people out of society that were working with the Roman army, right, who were the invaders. And so the Roman army, you know, was the occupying force, and the tax collectors, so they had to remit a certain amount back to Rome, but nobody knew what it was. And they had the power and the backing of the Roman army to collect whatever they wanted. So they just collected whatever they wanted. They sent what they needed to back to Rome, and they kept the rest. And so they grew very rich, just like Zacchaeus here. Right? It says he was very rich. And just think about what people are thinking about when they see Zacchaeus, when they see his wealth, and they know that his wealth is sort of ill-gotten gains. It's their wealth that he's taken with the backing of the Roman army, but there's nothing they can do about it. Right? But they despise him. He's a traitor for working with the invaders. Right? What kind of language do they use when they talk about Zacchaeus? Right? What do they say? How do they look at him when they see him out and about in the community? Right? He's an outcast living in the midst of them, and it helps us think about how we treat other people, right? Because especially we were talking about the lepers not too long ago, right? The lepers were outcasts, but it was very visible, right? You looked at them, they had sores, right? They were always shouting that, that they were lepers. And so they were outcasts, but you could tell. And Zacchaeus is outcast, but he looks like everybody else, right? And so how do we think about the different people we encounter and the different things people are bearing? Right? People have a lot to deal with. And sometimes you can see that. A lot of times you can't see that. You can't tell just by looking at someone everything they're dealing with. And so let us be, right, a people of great compassion. Because everyone's dealing with stuff. Right? So, anyway, so there's Zacchaeus being a tax collector. There's this whole complicated thing. And Zacchaeus knows this. Everybody knows it. Jesus knows it. Right? And so Jesus is passing through Jericho. And Zacchaeus, right, he can't join the crowd in the city, right, because he's so despised. So what he does is he runs ahead and he climbs the sycamore tree. And you may wonder, right, why does Luke need to tell us that Zacchaeus climbs the sycamore tree? But it matters, right? Because there's this rabbinical tradition that anything that happens under the branches of a tree affects the cleanliness, the ritual cleanliness of everybody under the tree at the same time. Trees were sort of viewed as tents, right? So it was kind of one big residence. So if somebody does something to defile themselves under the branches of a tree, and you're similarly under the branches of that tree, even if you have nothing to do with what's going on, you are defiled. And so if you had a tree on your property line, you trimmed all the branches on the tree that maybe went over into the neighbor's yard to make sure that you weren't impacted by if something untoward happened next door. So sycamore trees, right, with their big wide branches, weren't allowed to be planted in the town, but they had to be planted at least 75 feet outside of the town. So Zacchaeus runs, and that matters too, right, because men didn't run in those days, because to run, you had to sort of hitch up your robe and reveal your legs, and you didn't do this. It was scandalous. So men didn't run. But Zacchaeus runs, right, which tells us that this is really important to him. And then he climbs a tree. And again, men in those societies didn't climb trees, right? It was something children did, but a dignified person didn't climb a tree. There's this story about a man who served as ambassador to Egypt under President Kennedy. He's having a garden party, and he climbs up into a tree to fix a light. And apparently it causes such scandal that the president of Egypt reaches out to him and asks him if the story is true, because he can't believe that someone of this position would climb a tree. Right? People didn't climb trees. And so Zacchaeus runs, and then he climbs a tree, which means he's willing to risk scandal, additional disgrace, because he's so focused, he's so intent on seeing Jesus, right? Which makes us think, right? How motivated are we to encounter Jesus in our daily lives, right? We who know the full story, Zacchaeus didn't know the full story, right? This is pre-crucifixion, this is pre-resurrection, but Zacchaeus knew enough to know he would risk scandal, he would risk disgrace to encounter Jesus. What are we willing to risk to encounter Jesus every day? Do we have the same kind of intention? Or are we content to let someone else do it for us and to have sort of a secondhand faith, right? And I think, personally, right, when we think about the state of Christianity in America, do we have enough people who are actively involved in seeking to encounter Jesus in their everyday lives, in their everyday relationships, or do we have too many people who passively receive somebody else's Christianity, a professional Christian, right? Are we willing to risk anything, everything, to inconvenience ourselves, to actively get up and go seek out Jesus, to experience him every day? How are we driven? Right, so Zacchaeus, right, up in this large tree, maybe trying to hide behind some of these large sycamore leaves. Jesus doesn't pass by the tree, but he stops and he calls out to Zacchaeus. And imagine Zacchaeus' fear at this point, right? There's a crowd with Jesus, and they've gathered around the tree, and Jesus has stopped and has called out Zacchaeus' position in the tree. Again, disgraceful. And right, the crowd hates Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus knows this. The crowd knows this. Jesus knows this. And right, Zacchaeus knows who Jesus is, right? Otherwise, he wouldn't have gone through all this trouble to see him. And so he knows about Jesus' preference for setting things right, about Jesus' preference for the poor and the marginalized. And so Zacchaeus is probably very concerned that Jesus is going to join in with the crowd against Zacchaeus, who is taking advantage of others, using his position for gain, for ill-gotten gain. And right, the crowd's probably ready to join in Jesus' act. This could turn very dangerous for Zacchaeus very quickly. Right? The crowd's probably on pins and needles waiting for Jesus to launch some attack at Zacchaeus. But instead, what does Jesus do, right? Instead, Jesus issues this invitation, although it's really more of a demand, right? I must come to your house. Right, to stay with him, which bewilders the crowd, right? They're grumbling, right? Because when celebrity comes to town, right, the town would have wanted to pick the best house, the most honorable house, with the most righteous people to receive the celebrity, so it reflects well on the town. Jesus, though, right, picks Zacchaeus' house. Zacchaeus is hated in the town, right? And so this is a huge hit to Jesus' reputation, right? The decision to go to Zacchaeus' house costs Jesus something. His reputation is tarnished. The crowd is grumbling. Right? Grace is costly. Let us not forget that. It costs Jesus something. And it ends up costing Zacchaeus a lot too. Right? It hits him in the core part of his identity. In the beginning of Luke 19, the one thing we're told about Zacchaeus is that he was rich. Right? And so guess what? The first thing he gives out of when his life is transformed by the presence of Jesus Christ. Right? He gives from the central part of his identity and taking his first step on this new road of faith. He gives away 50% of his wealth and says anything he's gotten that's ill-gotten, he'll give back fourfold. Right? It's a massive first step for Zacchaeus. Right? All of which started by his desire to go encounter Jesus and his willingness to risk anything. And the crowd is stunned, and probably even more so when Jesus makes this announcement. He says, today salvation has come to this house. He doesn't say salvation will come when Zacchaeus completes dispensing of these gifts. He doesn't say salvation's drawing close, and if the audit properly lines up and Zacchaeus straightens up his life and flies right, then salvation will stick around. He says, today salvation has come. Right? Jesus brought it. And he left it as a gift, and it transformed Zacchaeus' life. When unconditional salvation arrives, excuse me, when unconditional salvation arrives at the home of a man who is surrounded by this cloud of sin. Right, same thing Jesus does for you and I. Right, we're surrounded by sin. Maybe we don't have a special category all to ourselves, but we fall into the larger bucket of sinner. Certainly, at the very least. And at the end of the day, we're unworthy of salvation. But Jesus passes through town, and even if we're hiding in a tree, Jesus comes to us. He comes and he calls us out of the tree, and he invites himself into our lives. Right? And he announces to everyone that salvation has come. Right? What will we do as a response to that salvation? What will we give out? What's the core part of our identity? And how can we give back out of that? Right? There's so much more. There's so much in the story, right? The temptation to stay inside. Avoid public ridicule. Avoid risking anything. Avoid paying the cost of discipleship. Right? Jesus faces the tremendous cost in dining with Zacchaeus. The crowd grumbles. His reputation is in tatters. Right? We all care about our reputations, about what others say about us. Right? But Jesus pays any cost to bring salvation to us. Right? Eventually it will cost him his life. Right? Our discipleship has a cost to us. Will we pay it? What will we give out of? What will our response be to what Christ has done for us? How will our life change when salvation comes to our house?